Nick Saban just had to tug on the thread that was holding it all together.
You are Locked On Trojans, your daily podcast on the USC Trojans, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Fight on, everyone. I'm your host, Mark Holkin, and thank you for making Locked On USC your first listen every day. Whether you're going to watch the show on YouTube or wherever you want to download your podcast, always remember this show is free, and never forget how much I appreciate your support. You can show your appreciation. If you're watching on YouTube, I need you to become a subscriber. I want you to smash that thumbs up, and I also want you to hit that bell notification so you don't miss one episode. Today's episode is brought to you by Jace Medical. Empower yourself when you purchase a Jace case. It provides you with a personal supply of 5 antibiotics that treat over 50 infections. Get yours today at jacemedical.com. That's J-A-S like Sam, E like Edward, medical.com. Last week, I briefly mentioned the day that Pete Carroll, Bill Belichick, and Nick Saban all stepped aside on the same day. Nick Saban's going to keep his corner office at Alabama. He's going to help Kalen DeBoer, helping out with that transition, making sure that when Nick steps aside, that everything just stays running the same way. But here's the thing. Nick Saban affected more than just Alabama and Washington. Washington's head coach is going to Alabama. Arizona's head coach, Jedd Fisch, he's going to Washington. So, again, when Nick Saban stepped aside, he kind of pulled the string and everything the domino effect just kind of took over from there. So you have the Huskies. They were the runner-up to Michigan, right? We know that Kalen DeBoer left the Washington Huskies for the prestige of Alabama. It's not that Washington isn't a prestigious program, but it's quite a few rungs down the ladder from Alabama. And as I mentioned, since then, Jedd Fisch has left Arizona to take the Washington Huskies head coaching job, which means Arizona's program needs a head coach. Arizona literally just won 10 games for the first time since forever. And Jedd Fisch said he didn't want to go anywhere. He was just kind of, he and the powers that be at Arizona, they were just working out the details, semantics, putting the final touches on the new contract. Well, we know that didn't happen, right? And now you have players all over the country. They're jumping into the transfer portal again. So who should USC look at? Because Alabama, they've got, when Nick Saban decided he's stepping down, that gave his roster 30 days to jump into the transfer portal. Same thing at Washington, same thing at Arizona. So from the Huskies, I'm thinking that USC, they should take a look at a few players. They've got the transfer portals open again, and take advantage of the situation, right? I'm thinking from Washington's team, they've got a veteran offensive lineman. His name's Nate Kalepo. That's who I would be first looking at. USC needs a veteran presence on their offensive line in 2024. Nate is 6'6". He's north of 320 plus pounds, and he's been playing college football since 2019. So, if you're looking to bring in a veteran presence for a year, that's the guy. He can play right tackle. He can also play interior offensive line. So I think he would be ideal to meet any needs that USC might have through the transfer portal. The last time that USC brought in a cornerback from Washington, Jacoby Covington, a couple of years ago, that looks like it's turning out to be a really solid contribution. Well, Washington has a couple of defensive backs that I think USC should consider, maybe get in touch with. You might recognize the name Dyson McCutcheon, class of 2021, 5'11", 185 pounds. Well, his dad, Dalen, played at USC, cornerback. then for the Cleveland Browns. And if you want really good bloodlines, if you're old enough to remember his grandfather, Lawrence McCutcheon, played running back for the Rams. So yeah, I would see if there's any interest there. As well as I would see if there's any interest with safety Asa Turner. And they have another young, I shouldn't say young, but they have another cornerback. His name's Jabbar Muhammad. I would see what kind of interest he has. But again, keep in mind, Trojan fans, this is a numbers game. Remember, USC, they don't have that many spots available. You've got your own recruiting classes coming in, and a lot of those got early entry guys are already on campus. They're working out doing the winter conditioning. So the Huskies have their head coach. We'll see if Jedd Fisch can stop any of the bleeding over there, and how many of the players he's going to bring with him from Arizona. Speaking of that Wildcats roster, this one has me feeling a little bit weird. Again, this is college football today. This is how it is. We just have to kind of wrap our heads around it. It wasn't that long ago that Jedd Fisch was doing an interview with Jim Rome, CBS Sports, and saying he didn't want to go anywhere. You know, he wanted to stay where he was at. He was happy with everything that was going on, yada, yada, yada. And let's not forget, he actually took over a bigger dumpster fire than the one Lincoln Riley took over at USC. He lost, the team he took over had lost 12 games. Yeah, they were bad. By the end of his third year, the Wildcats were a 10-win team. I think they finished number 11 in the final AP poll. They beat Oklahoma in their bowl game. And Jedd Fisch, well, he was going to have 18 of his 22 starters from 2023 returning. And they were moving to the Big 12 conference. That was going to be without Texas and Oklahoma. So you want to talk about having a really good chance to elevating Arizona's football team and getting them to the playoffs? 2024 was probably a good year for that to happen. Well, we'll see what happens with Arizona's football program now. They're looking for a head football coach. I want to talk about that more coming up during the show. But before we get to that, you know, who are some of the players that you might want to look at from that Arizona roster? Obviously, immediately everyone's going to think of their quarterback, Noah Fafita, who was the Pac-12 Conference Freshman of the Year. T-Mac, the wide receiver, Teratoa McMillan. If they leave, they're going to be a package deal, right? And they're probably going to follow Jedd Fisch up to Seattle. We'll see. I don't think they're going to come to USC. So what other programs could they look at? I would imagine if they don't stay in Arizona, they're going to follow their head coach up to Washington. I mentioned the offensive lineman from Washington, Nate Kalepo. Well, USC needs some size in their trenches. Arizona has a true freshman. Well, he was a true freshman. His name was Raymond Pulido, 6'7", 325 pounds. He started the entire season for the Wildcats. He started off at right tackle. By the time they got to their bowl game, they had some injury issues. He was their starting left tackle. And again, they were going up against a pretty good Oklahoma program. Point being, if you're a true freshman and you're able to play either tackle position, you probably have some value. If he decides to jump into the transfer portal, I think USC should seriously consider looking at him. Speaking of wide receivers, I mentioned T-Mac. What about Isaiah Bond, the wide receiver from Alabama, Crimson Tide? He was their leading receiver. I think he had 48 catches for over 600 yards. He was Alabama's #1 receiver as far as touches in 2023. We know that USC lost Ryan Pelham from their 2024 recruiting class, but they brought in a wide receiver transfer, Jaden Richardson. We know Nick Saban pulls in the best high school defensive backs in the country every single recruiting class. Well, he did the same thing in 2023. Des Ricks, he was the number 2 cornerback in the class. He's in the transfer portal. In my opinion, I think that would complete the Damani Jackson trade, right? You get our 5-star, we'll take your 5-star. Look, there's no doubt about it. Alabama's roster is fair game, and it's one of probably the most ripe out there for the picking. I mean, if you want players that everybody else wanted, if you're into this high school star rankings, Alabama's roster is loaded with 5- and 4-star players. So if Kalen DeBoer and Nick Saban can't convince those guys to stick it out, stay in Tuscaloosa, again, that's a roster. If I'm USC and I'm looking from that roster who's jumping in the transfer portal, I'm taking a hard look over there. Again, there's a lot of great players out there, but it's a numbers game. So, Locked On USC viewers and listeners, who would you take that's already in the transfer portal, or who's not in the transfer portal? Who would you suggest from those rosters you might want to think about coming to USC? Again, each of those teams have players that will be able to use the next 30 days to jump into the transfer portal if they wish to. We'll see what happens. The NFL regular season is over. We're in the playoffs, but there's still time to get in on the action with FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Right now, new customers, you're going to get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $150 in bonus bets, win or lose. And they've got an app that's really easy to use, and they got a variety of ways you can bet. They've got live same-game parlays. You can jump into the Parlay Hub and check out what they're suggesting. And they've got a thing called an Explore tab where you can explore a whole bunch of other stuff. So visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn and make your first bet an easy score. FanDuel, an official partner of the NFL. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local sports experts of Locked On, plus the national shows covering every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today. It's on YouTube, and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. I think we need to get serious about this idea of Pete Carroll returning to college football, and more specifically, USC. I mentioned last week on Locked On USC about Pete Carroll's new role with the Seattle Seahawks. But now that Arizona Wildcats head job is open, I'm not suggesting that Pete Carroll take that position, head coach at Arizona. However, if I'm Arizona's athletic director, I might consider Pete's kid, Brennan Carroll, who's been on Arizona's staff, offensive coordinator. I'd make him the new head coach. And then if I'm Brennan, I'm bringing Pops on down to coach the defense as my defensive coordinator. Pete could do the same for his son, Brennan Carroll, coaching the defense. You know, Pete still wants to coach. I kind of got that vibe. So if he decides, look, if Brennan Carroll's given the position at Arizona, he could say, hey, Dad, come on down. And we know one thing, Pete knows how to recruit, right? So he might be able to convince most of those guys to stay. Pete just got that ability, that charm. He could sell snow to an Eskimo. He's just really good in a crowd. But here's where I want to go with this with USC. Let me preface this by kind of giving you a little bit of history here. Back in 1977, during Pete Carroll's season as a college football graduate assistant, that was with the Arkansas Razorbacks. The head coach of Arkansas at the time, Lou Holtz. Well, when Pete was a GA over there, he met his future offensive line coach at USC, Pat Rule, who just happened to be a GA on that same Arkansas Razorback staff. So Lou Holtz was the head coach. Monty Kiffin was the defensive coordinator. Monty Kiffin became a mentor to Pete Carroll. Since then, Pete, he's won a couple of college national championships at USC. He won a Super Bowl up at Seattle. And he came close to winning another one at each program. We know he came close to repeating it at USC. And we know he was just a play away from winning a second one at Seattle. But Pete Carroll said he owes everything to his mentor, Monty Kiffin. Quote, "I owe him everything." Now the oldest head coach in the NFL. At the time, he was 65. This is when Pete Carroll said this. He taught me everything I know about defense. So this was 7 years ago when Pete Carroll made that comment. So if Pete Carroll isn't ready to hang up his coaching shoes, again, this would be a great way to kind of ride off into the sunset, working for his kid in Arizona, if that happens. Or in USC's case, kind of like how Nick Saban's going to make sure that Kalen DeBoer doesn't screw things up in Tuscaloosa. Make sure he doesn't fail. He's going to take a corner office, kind of take on an advisory role. Well, he could come home to USC and take on a similar type of advisory role, right? A couple of Lincoln Riley's mentors included Mike Leach, Dave Nickel, both of whom passed away after Lincoln Riley took over at USC. So that got me thinking. It got me thinking about the interview Lincoln Riley did with the LA Times earlier. Well, I shouldn't say earlier, but back in 2023, he was reflecting on, what's important in life. And he talked about life and football. He says, "I didn't want to have any regrets." That was that same interview where he was talking about, the NFL lifestyle and maybe retiring by the time he was 50 years old. Yeah, you guys remember that. Well, life experiences are kind of what help us get through our daily routines, right? And I would think that same philosophy is going to hold true for head football coaches who are kind of just looking to make it to their next game. Pete Carroll, look, he's no longer Seattle's head football coach, but he's apparently going to stick around in that advisory role. So if that thing in Arizona doesn't come to fruition, and this is what I wrote about over on wearesc.com, it was my Sunday takeaway. I said, Pete Carroll should return to USC as a defensive genius emeritus. The word emeritus, for all, for the Latin layperson out there, kind of like myself, it means you're retired. You're retired from, your professional life, but you've earned an honor of respect. You're someone who should be listened to when you speak. That's who Pete Carroll is. So again, to make sure that Lincoln Riley has no regrets later in his life, I think he needs to reach out to one of the best defensive minds that ever coached the game. Lincoln Riley should ask Pete Carroll to consider coming back to USC, not in a coaching position. He's already got his defensive coordinator, Antonlynn. He's got, well, we're assuming Eric Henderson's going to be the defensive line coach. It's going to happen. We know that he's got a defensive backs coach in Doug Belt. He's got a new linebackers coach in Entz, who used to be the head coach at North Dakota State. That's a lot of good defensive minds at USC, and Pete Carroll's not even there anymore. Again, I think Lincoln Riley should ask Pete to consider coming back and take on that advisory role, similar to the one that Nick Saban is going to have over there in Alabama. This is a way that Riley can learn from one of the best mentors out there. And as a bonus, he can learn it from somebody who, and I'm using finger quotes, gets USC. That's always been a sticking point. USC had to hire somebody who understood USC. Well, USC finally broke away from that mold Mike Bone was their first athletic director in a long line of who wasn't a member of USC's football program. Lynn Swann, Pat Hayden, Mike Garrett. It just, the list kept going on and on and on. Anyways, again, Pete Carroll gets USC, but he's also a great defensive mind. So who better to learn from than someone who knows a thing or two or three about Heisman trophies, right? Now, Lincoln Riley knows a few things about Heisman trophies, but those guys can swap stories and talk about that. But when it comes to learning about defense, Riley can't find too many mentors out there that would be better than Pete Carroll. And Lincoln Riley just turned 40 last September. So he's young. There's still a lot to learn. And if you could take advantage of it, why not, right? I know that Pete Carroll nor Nick Saban were available when Lincoln Riley hired Antonlynn to come be USC's next defensive coordinator. But again, since then, though, Nick Saban said he's going to stick around Tuscaloosa. He wants to be an advisor. He wants to see things through. So if I'm Lincoln Riley, I'm thinking, you know what? That's something that also matters to me. That's something I should consider. I want to remind everybody, this is what Lincoln Riley said this is what Lincoln Riley told the media after he hired Antonlynn. What I told Coach Lynn is my mentality going into it is we're going to do everything that we can in this program to accelerate the process of us playing great defense at USC. And whatever it takes to get it done from a development standpoint, from a staffing standpoint, from the way that we practice, everything here is going to be done with a defensive mind first. Those were Lincoln Riley's words after he hired Lynn. So I thought this would be the perfect time to repeat them. You see it? Because honestly, I'd hate for Lincoln Riley to have any regrets later in life, later in his career, because he didn't take the time to imagine the possibilities of repeating something at USC. Lincoln Riley is an offensive savant. The guy knows everything you need to know about game planning, calling an offensive game plan. I think the staff he's assembling on defense is a great step. So far, everybody who's talked about it at his level, from a peer level, says you're putting together a really good staff. Imagine the cherry on top. If you can say, you know what, Pete, if you're going to sit up in your lazy boy chair in Seattle, let's get you one down here in LA. Let's have you do the same thing down here. And don't tell me for a second that wouldn't help with recruiting as well. I know we come to sports to escape from some of the crazy realities of life, but can we talk just a minute about preparing for real life? According to the FDA, pharmacies are running out of antibiotics like amoxicillin, and that's happening right in the middle of one of the worst flu seasons in over a decade. So can you imagine a more helpless feeling than if one of your kids got sick while a supply chain issue kept them from their life-saving medications that they needed? Thankfully, they'll be okay because of Jace Medical. The Jace case is a pack of 5 different antibiotics that treat a long list of bacterial illnesses, including UTIs, respiratory infections, sinusitis, skin infections, among others. This stuff could happen to any of us. So visit jacemedical.com and complete your physician encounter. It will be reviewed by a board-certified physician, and your medications will be dispensed by a licensed pharmacy at a fraction of the regular cost. It's never been more important to be prepared than today. Go to jacemedical.com and use code LOCKEDON to get $20 off your order. Were you surprised that Lincoln Riley's name never came up for the open Alabama job? Dan Lanning's name came up, Oregon's head coach, and he's younger than Lincoln Riley. Kalen DeBoer's name obviously came up. He got the job. Now, why am I bringing this up? because both of those gentlemen, they took over at Oregon and Washington the same season that Lincoln Riley took over at USC. But both of those teams, Oregon and Washington, they kept developing. They got better each season in their first 2 seasons under their head coaches. Lincoln Riley, they looked great year 1. Well, they looked better in year 1 than they looked in year 2. I had to step back there because when I said they look great, I'm talking in regards to what Lincoln Riley took over. They went from 4-8 to 11-3. In that regard, they look great. But again, year 2, Lincoln Riley's team took a step back, whereas Oregon all year was competing for a conference championship and an opportunity to make the playoffs. Washington went undefeated, won the conference championship game. They were the runner-up to Michigan for the national championship game. So, how big of a hit did Lincoln Riley's reputation take because he hung on to Alex Grinch for that extra year? I mean, think about it. Lincoln Riley was the hot commodity, the talk of the town when USC brought him in to be their head coach. So I guess is that kind of a subtle setback for Lincoln Riley? Is that one way to look at it? I mean, both schools up there in the Pacific Northwest, they're headed to the Big Ten with USC, Oregon, and Washington. But again, only of the 3 schools, I can't forget UCLA, of the 4 schools, and Chip Kelly right now is what he is. Why wasn't Lincoln Riley's name at least mentioned to be in the conversation for that Alabama head coaching job? Again, Dan Lanning was, Kalen DeBoer. Just kind of throwing it out there. USC fans, how big of a hit to Lincoln's coaching reputation? How big of a hit did he take that Alabama wasn't even interested in bringing him in for a conversation? Is it because Washington and Oregon showed defensive development, whereas Lincoln Riley didn't? I have to imagine that's why. All right, let me change gears here real quick. How soon before that Eric Henderson to USC News becomes official? The Rams lost in their playoff game to the Detroit Lions. By the way, congratulations to Amon-Ra St. Brown. Fight on. He helped lead the Lions to their first playoff victory. It's hard to say this in 32 years. And also, by the way, Amon-Ra St. Brown, first team All NFL, even though he wasn't picked for the Pro Bowl. I don't care. I think All NFL is a more prestigious honor. So, when will that news break? It's going to happen. I know it's kind of it isn't official until it's official, but I would imagine probably in the next 24 to 36 hours. I'll tell you this, in the next less than 24 hours, Caleb Williams needs to file his NFL paperwork. If you're watching this episode of Locked on USC first thing Monday morning, today's the 15th. I'm recording this episode, and unless it's, being hidden, he hasn't filed yet. At least it's not public. So what's the delay? I mean, is Caleb Williams looking for a guarantee in writing from the Chicago Bears that they won't draft him? Or, is he just going to sit out spring camp at USC and then come back in the fall? Ooh, that could happen, right? No. I don't think Lincoln Riley wants that to happen. And that would, I don't know, I think that would rub his teammates the wrong way. Is he going to sit out spring and jump into the transfer portal? I don't know if he could do that because I think he'd have to sit out a year unless he falls into that, head coach left his program loophole. And remember, Lincoln Riley left Oklahoma, so Caleb Williams jumped in the transfer portal. there was a 30-day window that he didn't have to take advantage of because he was a first-time transfer. So does he still have that in his back pocket that he can use? I don't know. I don't know the whole ins and outs of how those rules work. What I do know is that he hasn't made it official yet. So what's going on? Here's USC's quarterback room right now. Miller Boss, Jake Jensen, and the recent transfer, Jaden Mayava. Those are your 3 scholarship quarterbacks, as well as Gage Roy, your walk-on. We'll see what happens. Maybe when I wake up in the morning, everything will be official. Caleb will have jumped into the NFL. I will be back with another episode of Locked on USC tomorrow, because that's what we do 5 times a week. I will talk a little bit about basketball. The men's team, the women's team who beat UCLA, they got a little bit of revenge. So I want to sneak that in there. But we're also going to talk some more football. So until then, everyone, you know what to do.